In the previous video, we finished the green armor of the model and also applied all the base colors. If you haven't watched the first video yet, then I suggest you do so now because the whole thing just makes more sense together. So you can check the video right here. And in this video, we are going to do all the non-metallics of the model, mostly focusing on the gold ones. The final goal is to create something that looks like old burnished gold or maybe bronze, with some verdigris added in the end. Since I wanted to keep this painting process relatively short, I didn't go into super crazy non-metallics. This is relatively simple, but still be advised, this is non-metallic metal, so there's a lot of steps involved. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you are watching PHLANS Miniatures. There are multiple ways how you can start doing non-metallic metal, and I tried a couple of them before, and the one that I like the most is when you start from a really dark base coat, which is your shadow color, right? And this time it's actually black, and we established that in the previous video. We are just going to go from black to this nice saturated brown to then consecutively lighter and lighter and more yellowish browns. We want to establish transition from black to the Rhinox hide, and we want to achieve full coverage with the Rhinox hide. This is very, very important because if it's not fully covering, it's gonna be losing all the saturation of the color. It's gonna be too dark, and in the end, the whole thing is gonna just look flat. Right, so there's going to be a transition between the black and then the overall surface that we want to cover with the Rhinox hide should be fully covered. As I was already working on the non-metallic metal parts, I realized that something is wrong with the armor, and the problem was that it was just too desaturated, so it lost some of its vibrancy and color, and that's just a byproduct of the glazing technique that I was using. But you usually realize this once you start putting colors around it, right? So sometimes you just have to like leave it as is, and then once you see the other colors around it, then you realize, okay, now I have to do something about it because it's just not good enough. And fixing it was relatively easy. I just took a contrast paint, which is a really nice saturated color. It kind of behaves like an ink in this sense, so they're really good for glazing in my experience. And I took the one that I love the most probably among all of those colors, or one of them at least, and that's Plaguebearer's Flesh. I took this color, created a very thin glaze, and then I just glazed the midtones in once again, re-establishing this vibrancy, taking care not to hit any of the brightest highlights so that I don't destroy them. And while we are at it, let's also fix a couple of other things and add a little bit of detail into the model as well. The first thing is to add the eyes, and the second one is to do some blacklining on the model. For the eyes, we are going to be using the most standard technique ever. So on a black base, we are just going to start to build up first Mephiston Red, and then Evil Sun Scarlet, and then Wild Rider Red, and finally Troll Slayer Orange. And then we add a little bit of a white dot in the dark area in the end to make it glint, and it's just perfect the way it is. And the black lining, it's actually a really fun step to do if you know how to thin your paint. So you're using a black paint, you thin it down to the point where it just flows into the crevices, and then what you do is you paint this black into every separating line between armor panels, between materials, basically every little crevice and nook on the model that you can find. And the reason to do this is to achieve definition on the model, because we are not using any washes here since we don't want to ruin our nice transitions. We still need to create these separating lines between panels and materials and objects on the model so that your eye is not seeing this blob of colors, but it sees different shapes that are separated by these, let's say, shadow lines that at least it interprets as lines of shadow. This step looks really insignificant, but it's really crucial, so don't skip it and learn how to do it. It's actually much simpler than it seems, and it's much less scary because yes, you're operating with black paint, but if you do it right, it just flows where you want it to flow, and it creates so much more definition on the model. So now that we are done with these intermediate steps, let's get back to the non-metallic metal. The good news is that once we are done with the Rhinox hide, we don't have to really think anymore, and now we can just have fun because we already established where the light hits the model, and now we just have to highlight the light further and further until we are satisfied with the luminosity of the golden armor. Following our process, the next color should be a lighter orangish brown, and Skrag brown from Citadel is actually the perfect fit for this. All we have to do is stick to the limits that we established with the Rhinox hide. We don't touch the black anymore, that's off limits, don't touch it. We are just going to paint within those patches of Rhinox hide and establish a nice transition so that some of the Rhinox hide is visible, then there is a transition, and then there is full coverage of Skrag brown. To be honest, when I say that you should not touch the previous color, for example the black or the Rhinox hide, that's not entirely correct, because it's always a good thing to create a little bit of noise in the previous colors with the current one. So let's say the Skrag brown, you can take that and create little dots or scratches if you have the skill for it in the previous color, and that will create a more natural feel to the model. Otherwise it's gonna look a little bit too clean. The second thing additionally to the transitions within the Rhinox hide patches is that we now really have to start doing edge highlights. Skrag brown is already perfect for this, and it's going to be already really visible, and once you're ready with it, once every edge is highlighted, every itsy bitsy tiny thing, then you will already kind of feel like this is metal, it's a metallic surface. Just remember to take your time with this. This is a pretty meticulous step, but also a pretty fun one, I would say. But you can mess this up if you are not using the right paint consistency, for example, and you try to rush your highlights, you try to rush your transitions because you really want to be done with it, then you will probably establish a too stark line between the two. And then you can go back with the previous color and try to smooth it out, and that will probably work, but that's just extra steps and more time that you need to put into the model. The trick in this phase is to master your paint consistency. If you know how to do that, you're going to have a lot of fun. And the way to do it is really to know what kind of thickness you need and how much pigment you really want in your paints at the time. So when you are doing your edge highlights, you would want to use a little bit thicker paint, because that gives you more control over where the paint is going. And when you do your glazing, the transition between the two colors, obviously you want to do a glaze or use a glaze which is way more thinned down, and it doesn't leave behind this really stark dividing line between the two colors. If your transitions turn out to be a little bit too drastic, too stark, what you can do is you can smooth them out a little bit with the previous color. So you take Rhinox hide, you water it down really well, like even thinner paints than the one that you use for the initial transition, and then you just brush away from the Skrag brown towards the Rhinox hide, so from the lighter color towards the darker color, and you just smooth out the transition. You go over this multiple times, you wait until it dries before you do it again, and then just apply it over and over again until the two colors blend together. Towards the end of this highlighting phase with Skrag brown, I decided that I should be a little bit more fancy, and even though initially I decided I would not be doing any bounce lights or anything like that, I still applied a couple of them or created some of them on the backpack and also on these little canisters that he has on like top of his head. When the light hits the cylinder, it produces this band on top, which we are doing already, right, with our normal lights. But it also produces usually a secondary light at the bottom of the cylinder, because the light hits the ground and then it reflects up onto the cylinder. Well, this is the thing that we are trying to simulate here in a very crude way, to be honest. But still, the way we do it is that we create the secondary band at the bottom of the backpack and these canisters, and we just make it darker than the initial light that is on the top. Once we are happy with everything Skrag brown, so all the edge highlights, all the transitions, then it's time to move to the next color in the line, which is medium flash from Vallejo. So this is a really light color, and that means that with this one it's really difficult to create the transition, at least in my experience, because it's too easy to leave behind too strong of a distinction between the two colors, right? This transition between the two colors is just going to be too obvious. But you can fix this by, once again, glazing a little bit of Skrag brown. And the other problem that we are facing here is that we really need to keep within the boundaries that we established with Skrag brown. We don't want to go over the Rhinox hide. Maybe if you want to create a little bit of scratch or like little dot here or there, once again, to create noise, but in general, you want to leave behind some of that Skrag brown to show, and then transition, and finally a tiny area of the medium flash fully covered. And once again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to hit all those edges and little bolts and whatever knots that are sticking out of the armor that would actually catch the light. So just make sure that you are diligent, that you hit every single one of them. Take your time. Just make sure that they are also relatively crisp, these lines, because the closer we get to the final highlight, the more we need to make sure that the edge highlights are crisp. Otherwise, this whole metal effect is not going to be too believable. Once you are done with everything, it might be worth doing a glazing step for basically everything that you did with Skrag brown once again, because how difficult it actually is to establish nice gradient with this color, at least in my experience. If you manage to do a perfect job, obviously you don't have to, but glazing with Skrag brown might actually like soften everything a little bit nicer together. The final step is obviously the same again, but with an even lighter color. And in order to achieve this, instead of selecting a new color, what I did is I used Ice Yellow from Vallejo and I added it to the medium flash. This is just a really nice and light yellow color, almost whitish yellow, but it has enough yellow in it that instead of desaturating the medium flash, it just makes it brighter. So I end up with just the same color but a much brighter version of it. The only difference between this step and the previous ones is, well, there is two of them. One is you really want to be conservative with the amount that you use of this color in your transition, because if there is too much, you are just going to make the armor too bright, but also too desaturated, and that's a problem we are going to have anyway, and we are going to be dealing with that, but you can make it way worse, and then you ruin some of the stuff that you did before. Then the other thing is that you don't want to use this on every single edge, you just want to use it on the ones that face up towards the light. At this stage we're actually pretty close to finish this, but if you look at the gold parts now, you might notice that it looks a little bit like washed out, a bit desaturated. And in my experience, at least, this usually happens when I do this. Maybe someone has a better way to do it, but this is usually the way it goes. But it's relatively easy to fix, because what is missing is that we kind of destroyed our midtones a little bit with all that glazing. Now we just have to put it back again. And the way to do this is to use the previous colors, especially in my experience, Rhinox hide is pretty good at this. So what I would do is I just make glazes of Rhinox hide because it's such a nice saturated color, and then I just go over kind of from the light areas towards the dark areas. I glaze it over and over again until I'm satisfied. And this smooths over everything and reestablishes this initial rich brown color, which then adds to the overall feel of the armor. You might want to like use some of the other colors as well to fix if you go overboard with this. So if it goes too dark, it goes too like Rhinox hidey, then you might want to use a little bit of Skrag brown and glaze it over that. So usually there's a little bit of back and forth here, but believe me, it's worth it. One thing to note is that you don't really want to glaze over the really bright highlights, because if you do, then the whole thing is just going to turn brown, and you really don't want to do that, right? So reserve this mostly for the midtones. So the Skrag brown and the Rhinox hide transition is the one that you would want to go for. And if you feel that you need to reestablish even more saturation, then I would just use the colors going up, so Skrag brown or even medium flash, to glaze back some of that life into the colors. But in this case, I felt that mostly just using Rhinox hide was enough. Finally, to finish off the bronze gold armor, I decided to be fancy again, and I busted out my off-white from Vallejo and added a tiny bit of highlight here or there, a little bit of edge highlighting only on the top, just to make it a bit brighter and also to re-establish our contrast a little bit more after this glazing step. So the gold bronze armor is finished, but there is a nice final step which seals the whole deal for me and makes it even cooler, which is Verdigris, right? Because Verdigris fixes everything, especially when it comes to death guards, since these guys, well, they tend to not be super clean and they don't really care about their gear, so obviously they would be a bit rusted and a bit, you know, corroded. And this is really super simple to do, but really high impact, especially in real life. It just looks awesome on the model. So what you need is a dark turquoise, which in this case was Stegadon Scale Green. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering the name of that paint, but I love it, it's awesome. And all you need to do is you just water it down, really it just flows. And then you put it into the crevices around the armor, and then you just dot it around places where you think Verdigris would form. And you just really need to make it look watery so that it leaves these coffee stains and marks. That's exactly what we are going for. And then you follow this up with the exact same step again, but with a lighter turquoise color, which in this case was Salted Green from Citadel. You water it down just the same, and you put slightly less of it into the exact same spots, so that once again you form this transition from dark to bright, and it will look exactly like Verdigris should, or at least as close as we want it to be. So it just looks awesome, I think. So the next big step for this model is to paint all the non-metallic iron and steel parts. And since this is the exact same process that I was using for the gold parts, but with different colors, which I'm going to show you soon, I'm not going to walk you through the whole process. Maybe we can revisit this in a future video. If you've made it this far, congratulations. I know that non-metallic metal can be a little bit daunting, and I'm still learning myself, but to be honest, as time goes on and you practice more, it just becomes easier and also way more fun to paint. So I suggest to give it a couple of tries. I say a couple because usually the first ones don't end up so great, but then it clicks, you start to get the hang of it, and you don't even want to go back to normal metal paints again. But now that we have finished with the non-metallic metal in this video, the next video is going to be about finishing all the rest of the model, the fleshy bits, the disgusting things dripping off of it, the finishing touches, and then finally the basing. If you would like to see the next video as well, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell button so you get the notification, and if you like the video, then please also give it a like. See you in the next one.